I'm Nicole Nalepa, and you're listening to Mommyhood Unscripted, real talk about moms for moms. Hey everyone, so happy that you made it to this episode, which is dedicated to all things autism. Since 2000, autism prevalence has gone up by over 400%. That is a staggering statistic when you think about it. That means that today, 1 out of every 36 US kids is diagnosed with autism. And autism is found 4 times more often in boys than in girls. I don't know if you knew that. So 1 out of every 23 boys are diagnosed with it. But we are so lucky to have Dr. Doreen Granpeesheh on Mommyhood Unscripted today. She's going to shed some light on this alarming increase in diagnoses. And she's also going to give us some advice on how parents can support their child in the best way possible and also be supported by their community. There is support out there. You are not alone. Dr. Granpeesheh is one of the leading pioneers in the world of autism and treatment. She has dedicated over 40 years to helping those with autism lead healthy, productive lives. So without further ado, Dr. Granpeesheh, thank you so much for joining us on Mommyhood Unscripted.
It's such a pleasure. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you so much.
So autism, it's something that we hear so much of nowadays. I feel as though everyone knows someone who has been touched with autism. From what I know, autism looks different for every kid, and it really impacts your ability to navigate in their world, right? And there are different levels and categories of that.
That's right. So let me first comment on what you said. You're so right that it has increased so much that everyone knows someone. When I started in this field, which was 1978, and when I would say I work with autistic children, people would say, oh, they're very good at art. They're artistic. Nobody really knew what autism was. The prevalence was 1 in 10,000 children. And now, of course, as you know, recently data came out from the CDC that was 1 in 36 children. And that's data that's from 2020. So it's already a few years old. And we assume it's increasing. Yeah, it's a very broad spectrum. It's very, very broad. So you can have a child with autism who's completely nonverbal and not able to communicate at all or take care of themselves. And on the other end of the spectrum, you can also have children who are very high functioning, minimally affected with autism, and are able to, with a little bit of support, kind of lead a very normal life. So it is a huge spectrum. I guess the diagnostic criteria to have autism, there are 2 areas that are affected. One is social communication. That means the child doesn't have eye contact, is not able to socialize or communicate appropriately with others. And on the other side of the diagnosis is an area called repetitive stereotypical behaviors. So these are things like insisting on routines or sameness, doing repetitive motor mannerisms, like looking at their fingers or body rocking or that sort of thing. And if you have enough symptoms in both of those areas, then you will receive a diagnosis of autism. But as you said, Nicole, there's severity levels. And the severity levels have to do with how much support the child needs. Mm-hmm. So if you are really in need of significant support in order to function, then your severity level will be 3. And if you are minimally affected by these symptoms, then your severity level is a 1. So that also makes quite a difference.
Okay. Thank you for explaining that. I never knew that before. And how does one go about getting a diagnosis, or what are some of the red flag signs that parents maybe should be on the lookout for if they suspect that, something is a little off with their child, with how they are responding to the world?
That's a great question. Unfortunately, even today, and this has been going on forever, you go to the pediatrician when you're suspecting that there's something going on, and often pediatricians will just say, it's a boy. Boys are a little bit behind girls. Just wait, go home and give it some more time. I think what I've seen, I diagnose, and what I've seen is the number one concern from parents is just the language development. a lot of times a child with autism will not develop language with peers. So they will be either nonverbal or pretty significantly delayed in the sense that by age, let's say 2, they will mainly be pointing to things they want or taking you to the objects they want instead of vocalizing the labels of those objects. So that tends to be a very early red flag. Mm-hmm. There are other red flags as well, of course. There are children who, for instance, if you call their name, they won't respond. They won't look at you. These are like signs of executive functions being behind. And so a lot of times, either the parents will start to notice some of these things, kind of the child is not connected. I can't do little peekaboo games or anything with my child. He won't respond. Mm-hmm. Those are the types of things that parents will see. And it's honestly, usually it's around age 1.5 to 2. And of course, the earlier you can get a diagnosis, the better, because the treatment is more effective the younger you are. So psychologists, psychiatrists, neurologists, all of these folks are experts in diagnosing autism. Of course, a lot of pediatricians have now received extra training in this area as well.
Wow. Which, when you think about where we've come, and how prevalent it is now, it's still pretty jarring to hear that the pediatricians aren't even, all aren't trained in this. And
actually, some states have like a 1-year wait list to get a diagnosis, which is also just unbelievable because that is such a critical year for the child to start learning.
And I can't even imagine the delay that is in terms of the support that the family needs to try and navigate through this too, let alone the support needed at school to get started. That's going to be so hard for the families.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think parents, by the time they get to me, and I'm usually doing the second diagnosis, they are just so worried. They've lost so much sleep over this because they've been struggling and trying to get an answer. Is it or isn't it? And if it isn't, what is this? What's going on with my child? And they're just exhausted already before even starting the journey.
Is there a blood test that some parents opt for? There was something about Fragile X that was being tossed around, I've heard before. I wasn't sure though exactly what it's about.
That's great. I'm so glad you asked that question. There are a number of, so let me back up and say what we kind of know about what autism is, mm-hmm. and then I'll link it back to Fragile X. Autism is a genetic predisposition that's triggered by something in the environment. And what has already been discovered is a number of different genetic disorders that resemble autism. Fragile X might be one of them. There are several now that have been discovered. And honestly, in some ways, you're kind of lucky if that happens because at least now we know what's causing it completely. Mm-hmm. But regardless, I think even if your genetic composition has not been discovered, what we do know about most of the children with autism is that genetically they have low redox. That means they are not detoxifying from the environment as much as we do. So, people have different redox levels, right? Like a terrible example, but let's say we both have a glass of wine. Mm-hmm. One of us is going to be, have a headache and not be able to get over it. And the other one's going to be just fine. That's our redox level, right? It's how fast you can detoxify from toxins. And kids with autism, whether they're exposed to toxins in our environment post-birth or even in utero, they're affected by these toxins. Their brain development is affected. And when I say toxins, I'm mostly referring to the pesticides in our food, mm-hmm. which have grown pretty substantially. And if you kind of put a graph of how bad our food has become over the years, it's pretty parallel to the increase in autism, but not just autism, other chronic illnesses as well, and problems such as infertility and so on. This is all due to toxicity in our environment.
Wow.
So on the one hand, no, there is no blood test. There is for the specific genetic disorders, but there's only a handful of them that we've discovered that are related to autism.
Mhm.
For autism per se itself has to be diagnosed on its symptoms.
Okay. And, I know we were talking about how important early in the intervention is. What about the other side of the spectrum, no pun intended, how we're looking at parents who they're told that, their child may have autism, but they don't want their child to have that label. I feel
Oh,
as though there are so many families that are struggling also with that. They don't want their child to have a label, or even if the child's old enough, they don't want to have the label themselves and go through life like that. So, what kind of advice would you give to them?
that's a unique circumstance. I hadn't thought about that, but I know I used to have a lot of parents who were just kind of embarrassed or didn't want anyone to know about the diagnosis. And I guess what I would tell them is that the diagnosis itself, that label itself, doesn't matter because people get scared of that label when they think that it's lifelong, right? And
Mhm.
I truly believe that autism can be reversed because so many of my children have learned tremendously and are leading completely normal lives. But so I don't want the parents to be afraid of that title, that label. To me, that label is just, it helps in the sense that A, it gets you insurance funding. B, it gives you some guidance as to where to get treatments, what kind of treatments might work. And C, it changes. Like the goal of therapy, early intensive therapy, is if you are a level 3 severity, let's say, to get you to level 2, level 1, and ultimately to get you out of the diagnosis because you've learned all those areas that you would have otherwise learned age 0 to 3. And
Mhm.
so I think that's what I tell them. It's not about the label, it's really about figuring out what your child needs. What are their needs? What are the areas they're falling behind on? And try to teach those, try to catch them up. Just like a child who goes to school and is weak with, let's say, math, and you get them a math tutor. This is the same thing. A lot of our kids don't understand things like taking someone else's perspective. Okay, that's something we can teach them. Or they don't know how to communicate verbally very well. That's something we can teach them using these very specific behavioral techniques. So really, it's just about that. It's about what are the areas that need support, and let's get that support for them early.
Mhm. So it's really you're helping them. It's not a label. You're giving them the help and the resources that they rightfully deserve and that they need.
Exactly, exactly.
Um, and what kind of advice do you have for parents who grieve the loss of what they thought in their head of what they wanted their child to do? Those expectations.
Oh,
It
yeah.
sounds so awful, but from some families I've spoken to who have received diagnoses such as autism, there is this grief process they've tried to explain to me. So what have
Oh,
you seen
absolutely.
there?
Absolutely. I mean, it is a tremendously difficult experience to have your child diagnosed. And I would say, parents, it's a lot of work
Hmm.
afterwards as well. It's a lot of work, whether or not your child actually makes it. But what I want to tell those parents is, and hopefully maybe in the future, Nicole, I can arrange and you can actually talk to some moms who had that fear and their children recovered beautifully and are doing tremendous things around the world right now. One of my kids got his PhD and lectures on robotics all over the world, and he was classified as a level 3. He was very severe. Another child right now has just finished college and is getting married. I mean, there's such beautiful stories about how, and these are children who are now, of course, in their 30s, 20s, 30s, and they stay in touch with me and they share their lives with me and they're living incredible lives. But those moms also, when they received the diagnosis, they were terrified. And of course, some of those moms were even before there was health insurance coverage. So that was even harder, that phase, because what do I do? How do I pay for the therapies that he needs now? we're very fortunate right now that there's early detection, that there's health insurance, there's a lot of providers of services, so you can get the help. Nevertheless, I think, any kind of thing that happens to our children, it produces a tremendous amount of fear and grief, because we're just, as you said, we have dreams for them. And to think that those dreams may not come to fruition it's just so, so traumatic. And I think it's important for parents to join groups of other parents, similar to what you're doing here, because it is incredibly important that the moms and dads get the support that they need early on, so that they're strong enough to carry their child through this journey. It's not something that's changed with some medication or some pill. You have to do, even if you're going to be a child who's successful, you have to do 3-4 years of very intensive therapy and work in order to get your child to a place where they can thrive. And so it's a journey, and the support from other moms, I think, is the most valuable thing.
Yeah, that'll help to lift you up, and let you know that you're not alone.
Exactly.
And I was going to ask you, how to make families feel seen and let them know that they're not alone. So those groups, those support systems, they're out there, right?
Oh, yeah, there's a lot of support systems. My dear friend and partner in business has a podcast called Autism Live, which for many, many years has been the number one podcast in autism. And she is a mom whose child is doing extremely well and just finishing college. And but she is someone who just is unbelievable in terms of, her name is Shannon Penrod. She recently wrote a book called Autism Parent to Parent. And in this book, there's like everything that you kind of need to know as a parent, and no one really tells you. So I really recommend her podcast, her book. There are many other parents. Another parent that I know very well, Ilana Gershowitz, has written another book. She had 2 children on the spectrum, and her book is called Saving My Sons. And it's also a tremendously valuable book for parents. So, if you look out there, you'll find these incredible resources that just give you direction and support and hope.
Wow. Thank you for sharing those resources.
Sure.
We'll be sure to pass those along too, to our listeners. And I also wanted to ask you, in a society where the social stakes are so high, how do we return to meaningful, inclusive participation? Like, where our differences are celebrated?
Yeah, wow, that's an incredible question, Nicole. So, I think we're doing a lot better. And this, coming from someone who's been in the field for like 45 years, I can tell you that things have improved a lot. I recently did training for large organizations like Oracle, for instance, where they have thousands of employees. And this had to do, the training is all based on, how do you change things a little bit to be more inclusive of individuals on the spectrum? And what are some things that these large companies and workplaces can do so that folks on the spectrum can also thrive and have jobs that make them happy and meaningful lives, and colleagues that are supportive, and so on. So I think, these types of efforts, I think, are very, very important, because absolutely, I mean, this is not something that we understand completely. Let me just say, there are children who are very, very severe, and obviously their parents and guardians want them to learn new skills just so that they can survive and possibly thrive in life. And then there are individuals who are kind of on the spectrum, but the higher end of the spectrum, and they say, we don't want to be changed. We want to be accepted the way we are. And to some extent, as long as it is possible to fit them in social life, then I agree. And I think that we should do everything we can to accommodate them. But there's so many good things that have happened. For example, there are now movie theaters that have sensory sensitive days. So some day, like let's say Tuesdays, they will play the same movie, but it is lower lighting, lower sound for individuals on the spectrum, so they're comfortable. And so as a society, I think we're beginning to learn more and accommodate more.
Which is so important. And, we have some of those things here in Connecticut too, at the movie theaters or events, where they make sure that it's not overstimulating. And speaking of overstimulation that I just brought up, that was one of the questions some of the moms I've been talking with. What do they do, or how do they help their child with autism when they are overstimulated? And also on that meltdown verge there.
Oh, sure. So we could talk about those two separately.
Yeah.
So the overstimulation is really something that you can start to control, what we call antecedent control. So try to do some things ahead of time so that the child has tools. And I always like to compare it to just typically developing people. For example, I have pretty dark eyes. My husband has very light blue eyes. And when he goes outside, if he doesn't have his sunglasses, he's getting a headache right away. And I don't even wear sunglasses, right? So for him, it's a tool, an accommodation is that he must have his sunglasses. And I feel like this is very similar to people on the spectrum. When you're going to a very overstimulating location, try to make sure that your child or adult's child has some tools that they can use. For example, they can have earbuds, or they can have headphones that are noise canceling or noise reducing. And that's not an inappropriate thing anymore. The younger generation, everybody has something on their ears, right? So yeah. That really, if you can teach your child, oh, you know what, when the noise is bothering you, these are some things you can do. You can take your headphones, you can go to a quiet place. We can go outside and walk. You can always go and get some peace in the car. Those are types of things. Visually, the same thing. There are colored prisms that help the kids. There are lots of different types of glasses that will help the child kind of reduce their stimulation. And so I think that helps when it comes to entering environments and just practice, honestly, Nicole. If you can gradually expose the individual to those types of more chaotic environments, the shock factor is gone and they can deal with it better. So that's in terms of that. Now, challenging behavior is really interesting because yes, individuals with autism they exhibit challenging behaviors. They can tantrum, they can aggress towards themselves or towards you. They can spit, they can throw objects, run away, all kinds of behaviors that are challenging. But what's really interesting is none of these are part of the diagnostic criteria. They're not part of the diagnosis. So why do they happen? They happen because the individual doesn't have a better way to communicate. So they get frustrated and they show these challenging behaviors. So as an example, typically developing child of 3 years old, they'll be like, you'll say, it's time to go, put your toys away, let's go. And they'll be like, no, I don't want to go. Can I have 5 more minutes? And all that sort of stuff, right? Our kids don't really comprehend that this is just a brief stop. We're going someplace, we'll come back and you can resume playing with your toys, for instance. So what they think is when you say it's time to go, they're never going to get back to their toys. They just don't understand exactly the concept of time or, any of those things. So they don't have a way to say, oh, no, can I have 5 more minutes? They don't have that language. So what they do is they'll throw a tantrum. And usually what happens is when a child throws a tantrum, the parents will kind of give in for a little bit, right? We'll be like, okay, you can have 5 more minutes. We give in. So what we're doing is we're telling the child, your tantrum is an effective way of communicating with me. If you don't want to do something, tantrum, I'll give you 5 more minutes.
Right.
So kids learn that these challenging behaviors become their communication. And with therapy, what we do is applied behavior analysis, ABA. What we do is you teach the child that the tantrum won't work, but you have to either use your language, use some form of iconic communication if you're nonverbal, communicate in a more adaptive, acceptable way, and that will work. And that way, our children are rewarded every time they communicate in a non-challenging way.
Mm-hmm.
And honestly, after just 6 months, these children are smart. They figure out how to communicate better, and all of the challenging behaviors go away. But it is hard. It's very hard because a lot of times challenging behavior will occur in public. You know, you're in a supermarket, child wants something, and you can't give it to them, and they'll throw a major fit, and parents are embarrassed and panicking and don't know exactly what to do at that moment.
Right.
That's why it's really helpful if you have a team of behavioral people, behaviorists, working with you, because they'll teach you how to handle the child in every scenario.
Hmm. Yeah, you do hear a lot from parents when they're up against time or and they're the meltdowns. That's so hard. And and I think on the other end it's really important for people out there to realize that you should never judge when you see a child having a meltdown in public. You never know what that family is going through, what that child is going through.
That's such an important point. I mean, and then I think until you have children, it's hard to remember that, right? I mean, I have three children who are adults now, but every time, I mean, I remember traveling with them when they were very young. So every time I see a parent on a plane whose child is crying or tantruming, I'm the first person to go up and say, "How can I help?" You know,
Oh.
and instead of sitting there and thinking, "Oh my God, I'm sitting next to this baby who's going to cry for 4 hours," you
Hmm.
really have to have sympathy and understanding, because these are tremendous parents. They're amazing people, and they're doing the best they can.
Hmm. No, absolutely. And it's nice to show some kindness. If you see a parent struggling, it's nice to be kind. I appreciate that you do that. I'm gonna do that too.
Absolutely. I mean, you know how they're feeling. You know,
Right.
they're just completely panicked and embarrassed. And they know, a lot of parents will tell me I'm being, other parents are judging me. They know how people are thinking. So it's just the right thing to do is to see
Hmm.
what you can help.
Yeah. And if you've had kids, you've been there before. Sometimes people
Yes,
forget, but you've been there
yes,
before, most likely.
yes.
I want to transition to those who are on the spectrum and later in life, so they're transitioning, say, out of high school and maybe going into a transitional program until they're 22, and also even after 22. A lot of parents, from what I hear, they struggle, what kind of things are out there for my children? I know it varies depending on where you live, but where can they look? Do you have any insight into that?
Yeah, yeah, it's difficult. It's very, very difficult because I agree with you. There's fewer and fewer services for adults on the spectrum. Now, it's one thing if you're minimally affected and all you need is a little bit of support and you can go through college and live a typically life, normal life. But there are a lot of adults who are need continual support in order to have a healthy life, happy life. And there's different levels as well. So, I mean, I have adults who are so seriously affected that even in their 30s, they're completely nonverbal, have not been toilet trained, cannot express themselves in any other way, and are extremely frustrated and therefore have become self-injurious. And that is extremely difficult because there are only a few centers in the country that will accommodate those particular adults. The Marcus Institute in Atlanta is one of them. The Kennedy Krieger Institute in the DC area is one of them. And there are a few of these organizations that will take those individuals and help teach them better communication and how to kind of live in daily social environments, right? But generally speaking, parents remain responsible for these individuals, and there's just not enough service for adults. An organization that was started in Arizona, Phoenix area. The parent who started it, her name is Denise Resnick, and she she still does, a company called SARC. And they have started an adult center, which is absolutely lovely. And I know that other parents of adults are starting to do this as well across the country. And these centers are all sorts of places, Nicole. They can be, for instance, places where it also has apartments. And depending on the severity of the individual, either you are living with one other person who is assisting you, or for instance, if you're able, you're living in your own apartment, but there's a caretaker living in the apartment below you and who checks on you, those stuff. So different levels of accommodation. But they also will teach you vocational skills. They will help you find a job. They will help you understand how to get public transportation, how to go to your job. There's all sorts of things. There's a gentleman, I think he is in New Jersey, if I'm not wrong. I met these folks, and his brother was on the spectrum. So he opened a car wash and taught his brother how to work at the car wash. And this turned into a huge business now, where he has multiple car washes, and they're all special needs individuals working there. So, you know, families, what I've seen over the past 45 years, families in this field are incredible, and they are starting to really pay attention to the adult population and help them find jobs, help them get leisure activity, help them be able to live happy, independent lives.
And when you have the statistics, you know, of how many kids are being diagnosed each year, I would think that in the next 10, 20 years, we'll probably see more of these things start to open up and be more common.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the numbers and how they have increased, I just was at a conference 2 days ago, and there was a gastroenterologist speaking about the number of patients that he sees with autism and how it just continues to, and he's at Harvard. And he was saying that, you know, honestly, if this rate continues in another decade or so, every child will have some aspect of it, because 1 in 36, and if you think of 1 in 36, which is data from 2020, and these were children who were, you know, already 4 years old. So we're talking, actually, this is data from 2016, kids who were born in 2016, and now we're in 2023. Nothing much has changed with toxicity. If anything, it's gotten worse. And, you know, because it's 4-to-1, boys to girls, we're talking 1 in 36 children means 1 in 23 boys. I mean, it's unbelievable, you know? And so, yeah, it has increased. And because of that, a lot of resources and funding goes to the earlier generation, the newer kids. And that's why the adults are not getting as many of the resources, unfortunately.
That's why it's so important, like, you know, we said earlier, to find your tribe, find that community, because, you know, you're obviously more powerful together, and you never know what you can start and what kind of groups are out there for you as your children grow older, you know?
Absolutely right. Very important.
Well, I know that we're running out of time, but before we go, I want to make sure to let people know that you have been in the podcast world.
Thank you. So I've been doing a show called Ask Dr. Doreen. And we've been doing this for, I think, 12, 13 years or so. And every week, I'm live on Tuesday mornings at 10 a.m. Pacific time. But the show, of course, is on every podcast you can imagine. It's on YouTube. You can actually see us. And if you can join us during the live segment, or if you just get on my website, DoreenGranpeesheh.com, you can just put in your questions ahead of time, and I will answer those questions live on the podcast. And as I said, we've been doing this so long that we've cataloged all these questions and answers. And on YouTube, if you ask a question, how do I potty train my child? A whole bunch of different shows will pop up that where I've talked about that and specifically given you step-by-step guidance on that particular topic. So I hope it's a good way to help parents, and we love doing it.
Absolutely. Hey, just another wonderful resource for people out there.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. I really appreciate your time and everything that you're doing. I mean it truly. You are a pioneer in this field and you have helped so many people and given them that hope that they really need to hear.
Thank you very much. It's been such a pleasure speaking with you. Love that. Thank you.
Likewise.
Have a great day.
Thank you. And we'll have to have you back on again soon.
I'd love to. Thank you.
If you like what you heard, make sure to subscribe to Mommyhood Unscripted. Share it with your friends, too. It's available on iTunes, Google Play, Roku, and everywhere else you get your podcast. I'm Nicole Nalepa. Thank you so much for listening. And remember, Mama, you're doing great.